Everybody, I unmuted.
Good.
Hear me now? Good. Baruch Hashem. This is like Sim. The Nishma of Nissen. Okay, good. Good. Okay, I'm looking forward to get started. Okay, how did this whole thing get started? With Rabbi Green telling me all about this opportunity to do this. So I spent some time preparing. How did I get started with Rabbi Soloveitchik? I was a Talmud of Rabbi Soloveitchik in the early 60s. And I still remember, like today, it's almost 60 years ago, that I was sitting in the shiur, and the first time, and the first shiur that he gave us was the shiur on Kia Shofar. As I was sitting there, it was almost difficult for me to listen to him, because I was so excited and almost in awe of sitting by a grandson, an anicle of Reb Chaim Soloveitchik. I still remember my Zayda telling me that when he was in Bialystok on a Friday night, Reb Chaim came to Bialystok from Brisk, and the shul he described was lit up beautifully, not with electric, with fire, lights, torches. And he said to me in Yiddish, "A klein Yiddele is reingekommen." A little Jew walked in, but ein Zach, the Shechina hat gescheint auf sein Panim. And the Shechina rested on his face. And I was sitting by his grandson. And that was, it took some time for me to push away all that excitement and feel that, and the intellectual need to use my brains to listen to Rabbi Soloveitchik. Rabbi Soloveitchik had something very unique about him. All yeshivas, the Talmidim, have a lot of things in common. Chaim Berlin Talmidim are a Chaim Berlin Schnit of personality, mere a certain way. By Rabbi Soloveitchik, almost every Talmud was very different. What he really preached was that, and he tried very hard, is to teach us a love and commitment to Torah, and secondly, to think for yourself. And therefore, in his thousands of Talmidim, it's very, we find many times we're so happy to see each other, those that are left, and from my class, and we have something very unique about us. Everybody found his own way. Everybody learned their own way. So let me get started. I chose the Rosh Yeshiva to talk about Pesach, of course. So we're focused on the Agada, but I wanted to, and a lot of the things that we're going to talk about, hopefully are very familiar, but it has a lot to do with how I saw Rabbi Soloveitchik, and how my Rabbi, and how I perceived a lot of the things that he did and said, and looked a little bit more into what made him say and do the things he did. So one of the first things that I'm going to want to talk about is the Seder, the word Seder. I mean, I myself, when I come to the Seder, it's almost a sense of awe, a sense of Yomim Noroyim. There's no doubt about it. When you look at it, this Seder night was a night when, at one time, we partook of the Korban Pesach. The Seder night was so connected to the Beis Hamikdash. The Seder night was so connected to Yerushalayim. And it's many times hard to give over those feelings. The kids come with their loose sleeves, and they sit, and the grandchildren and great-grandchildren sit and talk about what they had prepared. And it's almost a feast, a sense of going to enjoy the knedlach and mom's food and so forth, and family getting together. But there's more, and that's what I think Rabbi Soloveitchik wanted to give over to us. Rabbi Soloveitchik looked at the Yom Tovim almost in a one type of category, and this is what he was given over to him by his Zayda. He talks about that a lot. He said many times, he said, I couldn't give over the feelings, the emotions, the commitments that my Zayda had to Torah and to the Masorah. And I tried, and I don't know if I could, he said. But he did. So let's talk about that Seder night, the Seder night that's involved with a korban, the Seder night that's involved with kedusha, and he focuses on the word Seder. He says, I'll start. The Rav would give Gemara shiurim and public drushes before the days of Rosh Hashanah and Aseres Yemei Tshuva. We were imbued really with an experience of confrontation before HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Beyond the sound of the shofar, the kolos of the tekiyos were heard. The sense of the avoda of Yom HaKippurim, of being and feeling almost like in the Beis Hamikdash. I remember that I one day in shul, I felt Korim, and near me was a friend of Hasidic background. He never saw something like this. The sense of awe and fear of the Yontif. It's a different way of looking at Yontif. Yom Kippur is a day of redemption and cleaning of stains of sin, and was overshadowed by the anticipation of the Avodas Yom HaKippurim. So the night of Seder becomes an exalted evening. It denotes a mandatory structure as used by the Rambam. Seder, kol ha'maisim shebiyom zeh kachu, heim avodas Yom HaKippurim. And the Rambam continues, kol avoda she'oved bevigdei lon beheichal tzarech la'asosan ala Seder. The Rambam talks about Seder, but he also talks about the Seder, not only the Seder of Pesach, but of course the Seder of Yom HaKippurim. So the word Seder of Pesach and the word Seder of Yom HaKippurim have something common together. And the Seder has to have an order. Imagine having a Seder where you would put all the things that you have to do and say the Agada, and separately then go sit down and eat. The whole sense of the Seder, the order and what comes together and what comes first and second is important as the days of the day of Yom Kippur. He says, call me, and then call me, the Rambam says, call me shalom shlosha dvarim beleil tesvav lo yotzacha boso be'elohein Pesach matzu umara udvarim elu kulan nikroyin haggadah. So you have this whole piece that we put together, but I want to jump into the idea that really caught my eye or caught me the first time I noticed it. I don't even remember if I was in Shia then, but I reading it that a Posek that Rabbi Soloveitchik chose to try to talk about the Yontif Pesach, the Seder, and he brings a Posek of Yisro becoming before Moshe, and he says, and Yisro, the father-in-law, comes and wants to do something good and important, and he did. Vayikach Yisro Chosei Moshe, Olo Zvachim, Lakum v'yavo Yadro v'chol ziknei Aaron v'chol ziknei Yisrael, Lechol Lechem im Choson Moshe lifnei Elikim. It's the idea of a table. This wasn't Pesach. It was the idea of setting a table where people will join together, and they'll join together with a korban, and they'll be standing there before Hashem. This recreation of Yisro coming to Moshe and setting this table is the table of the Seder night. And that's what has to be the sense of recreated. There's a lot of recreations that night. The night, the feeling of Geula, the sense of you yourself being in Mitzrayim, you yourself being redeemed. But it's the Seder night, the Seder, the table before Hashem, the table with the korban, the table of joining with people, and that's almost the whole beginning of the Seder. So and he points out, Rabbi Soloveitchik, and he wants to point out the idea of Birchas Hamazon with this. If a man wants to redeem his eating activity and sanctify it, he must invite Hashem to partake of the meal. And this is what Yisro did. He says, this introducing Hashem into the circle of men enjoying their food is not a drush, a homiletical image, but a solid Torah Shebechsav idea. And that's what he says before Hashem. And the Birchas Hamazon kind of redeems man and brings him up to that derech. And that called Dichvin Yesef Yifsach, you always think of matzah, but it's really called Dichvin Yesef Yifsach, is to join together the idea of the Korban Pesach. It's not only joining together with eating together, and they're not only joining together and sitting with people that you know, because that's the knufia, the idea of bringing together the chabura of the Korban Pesach, but it's more so. It's the sense of sitting together and not only sharing matzah and food, perhaps also sharing feelings, sharing understanding of the day. It's a day of chesed. Rabbi Soloveitchik had a lot of Zohar Kabbalah ideas. You know, he always told us in Shi, he said that when he was a little kid, when his father was a Rav in Russia, the Lubavitch understood that there's a little Eloi growing here. And they spent a lot of time with him. And they taught him, instead of teaching him Rambam, they taught him Tanya. And he said in his own way, he says, I still remember, I like that sefer very much, he said. And those ideas always were in his head and his mind and his emotions. And so we spoke about the day of chesed. This is idea that maybe it's confrontation like Yom Kippurim. It's confrontation of meaning confronting HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Shmon Esrei, confronting HaKadosh Baruch Hu in Mekabel Ol Malchus Shemayim. But it's a different type of Kabbalah. It's a different type of being Omed Lifnei Hashem. It's the idea of chesed, the idea of giving chesed, sharing, extending and expanding yourself, like the idea of Avram Avinu, the chesed of Avram Avinu. That night, this is a night of sharing and sharing ideas, sharing kedusha, but sitting Lifnei Hashem. And this is, I think, a very important idea. This is one of the pieces that I put together that I really felt how Rabbi Soloveitchik looked at Pesach. You know, this is how the Rosh Yeshiva looked at Pesach. The Posek has different ideas, but this is the idea of Rabbi Soloveitchik. And then let me go on to it. He says he goes into, Rabbi Soloveitchik really was listen, to give you over a shir now. That's not what we want to do. He says, but I do want to give over some of his ideas that he shared with us, and many times not in shir, but with his he was a Rav. He was a Rav in Boston, and the closeness that he had with his people of his kehila and of his congregation and of the school that he founded with his wife, was very special. And Rabbi Soloveitchik, besides being the Rosh Yeshiva of giving a shir, because when he came into shir, it was like grandfather and him, it was a sense of Reb Chaim there, but he worked out a piece of Gemara and worked hard on it. And when he came in, he said himself, he shared this idea. He was frightened. He was frightened of the young kids sitting there that could have been his grandchildren, and trying to reach out to them. And as he started going into his share in depth, and sharing his ideas with Talmidim, he kind of relaxed, and he kind of felt that this is a connection. This is the Masorah. And he shared with this idea. He said, with this concept of sharing ideas, he says, between young and old, he says, this will be, the return will be that we will see a redemption. We will see Geula. So let's take a look at how he looked at a Posek, and how he used this Posek to understand the Seder night. And let's go to a second piece. It's a sense of his look at Jewish history and destiny. You say Rabbi Soloveitchik Rabbi Soloveitchik was a Rebbe in every life situation that allowed him to teach. It was Motzi Shabbos. He would teach Ramban and Chumash to the college students in Boston. In the 1950s, I understand he taught classes in Bernard Revel, teaching Jewish history and philosophy. His sermons, his drushes, were the material that has made great pulpit rabbis. He was not a rough cook that his Zionism enhanced every part of his Torah, but it was a devout religious Zionist. And he taught us how to understand and appreciate and love the great matana that's called the Jewish state. Understand, Rabbi Soloveitchik came from a family that were not Zionists. He came from when he joined the Mizrahi and became its president, it was not received favorably in the family. But he went ahead. He was brave and went ahead. He saw us as a great people. Not only Knesset Yisrael, which is the existential idea of the Jewish people of the past, present, and future, but he saw all the Jews. He saw the secular Jew. He saw the Jew of today, which is most of us are secular. You don't forget, there was a time that there was hardly a Mechalel Shabbos in our community, right? And when the Zaydas came to America, it was hardly a Shomer Shabbos. So he says, so he also made a place in history for the secular Jew. And let's go with it. But it's a combination of his understanding of a Posek. It's a combination of an understanding of Posek. Not only let's take a look at a Rashi, the Ramban, and the Mefarshim. Let's learn a Posek. Let's learn a Posek with scripta sancta, without any Mefarshim. Let's look at it and let's understand it. Let's look at the Posek and between the Psukim. What does it have to tell us? This is what Rabbi Soloveitchik taught. So he starts off with one of the most important pieces of our Seder, which is Arami Obed Avi. So let's take a look at what he does with Arami Obed Avi. Arami Obed Avi may form the core of the Agada, yet there's a number of ways to understand it. Let's take one. It's almost strange, dreadful, that Lavan Arami is modern day Syria, to annihilate him and his progeny, both male and female. He's telling us that's what how the Agada is interpreting it, and that Lavan Arami was so upset with Yaakov leaving that he wanted to destroy him and his entire family. When Yaakov left Aram without permission from Lavan, he pursued him. He looked at him as an Eved. How did an Eved run away? Also an Ivri from the other side of the river. He's an Ivri. We were always different. From the time of Avram Avinu, we are, and that's part of our history. His descendants should share the same destiny. Both Egyptians and Aram hate us. He says, let's translate the Rami Obed Avi. Lavan, that's Lavan sought to destroy him. He says, and that's how the Yonasan ben Azil describes. He says, at first Yaakov went down to Aram. However, Lavan sought to destroy him, and Hashem saved him from Lavan. Afterwards, Yaakov goes down to Mitzrayim. In other words, had Lavan not planned to destroy Yaakov and him, while what does he say? The whole household, Hashem would have left Yaakov in Aram and spared the whole Egyptian experience. That's where the Golus would have been. The Golus wouldn't have been Golus Mitzrayim. It would have been Golus Aram. That's so therefore, because of Lavan wanting to destroy Yaakov and his family, there was no other alternative. He says this was the alternative. Vayomel Avram Yadoa Teda Ki Gei Years Aracha Be'eretz Lo Lahem V'Avadam Binu V'Osam Arba Meo Shana. Why did Hashem choose Mitzrayim as the Golus? Because Lavan wanted to destroy our family completely. He says to be in exile in Aram would have meant total liquidation of Yaakov. Therefore, Vayered Mitzrayim. That's why. That's pshat in the Posek. That's pshat in the Posek. That's pshat in the Agoda. Arami Ovei Ravi. And therefore, because he wanted to destroy us, therefore Hashem said, "I'll take them down to Mitzrayim." This understanding underlies the portrait of the Jewish historical destiny. Mitchila and this Arami Ovei Ravi comes with introductions. And it's one of the first introduction is Mitchila Ovei Avodah Hayel the Yakshav Kervanu Hamakom Lavodaso. What is Lavodaso? To serve as Hashem, and not to be part of the Torah. I took your father Me'aver Hanar as the Medrash, because all the world was on one side and Avram was on the other. There's another introduction into this Arami Ovei. Is Baruch Shomer Tachasa. Our history is very strange, Lebeshik says. One is a fulfillment of divine promises, but a very slow pace, slow pace. From Avram, the mice of Avram and redemption, hundreds of years pass. And he kind of alludes to our long goals. He says part of the introduction is, the third part is V'hishayom Hoseinu Bolanu Shalo Echad Bilvad Say Elomad. The Haggadah introduces Lavan as the enemy of his people. When we study Parshas Vayetze, we see Lavan as a liar, a cheater, but not a killer. Chazal sees Lavan as a psychopath, a Jew hater. They saw the meaning of the Posek where Lavan and his men were pursuing him by Yava Leikim El Lavan. HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to come to Lavan, Harami B'chalom Halayla, as the Posek itself said, Vayomelo Hisham Elecha Pen Tidabru Im Yaakov Mitol V'Yadra. It's HaKadosh Baruch Hu stopped that. He stopped the murder of the Yaakov family. He said, and then he goes on. Yeshlo Yadi Lasosi Mochem Ra Vilekei Avicham Emesh Amar Lai. Lavan himself says, he said, I wanted to do bad imochem, not with you, Yaakov, with your whole family. He said, and he calls them Elokei Avichem. I look at my daughters and everything and my grandchildren. Why did I look at them? I look at them as that they belong now to Elokei Avichem. He says, nothing short of divine intervention would have stopped Lavan from implanting his plans. Lavan, like the madmen of the final solutions, Rabbi Soloveitchik always sees today in Chazal. He says, Lavan's life, the madman of final solution, the plan to exterminate every single Jew. The hatred of our enemies is abnormal. He says, that's what's frightening. That's part of the Haggadah, that Jews stand together, all of us, and that's and something that brings our history together, and of course frightens us. Lavan wanted to uproot everything. He says this kind of hatred of the Jew is indicative totally of insanity. He says, but the Mitzrayim experience was something, and he says, and we went down to Mitzrayim. So he in short form talks a little bit about the Mitzrayim. He says one of the synonyms for a nation is Am, and he says, and Am, the Vilna Gaon says, Im is a people bringing them together, and these people, they shared something. They shared a certain sense of sympathy, of Rahmanis. The experience of Avdus Mitzrayim, he says, taught gave the Jewish character, Jewish morality. He taught us Rahmanis. And the shorish of Rahmanis is Rechem. Rechem. He says the womb, the like when it talks about sheep sown, it talks about, and even in tefillin, davening, it talks about sown and rechem, the love that, and you could tell it, and you could recognize it even in the animals, the idea of the tzon and the rechem, what it has for its calves, the love of a mother for a child. And the Rambam writes in Hilchas Day is Chayev Adam lahezoya b'yisayim v'almanos ibnei shenafsho shveila lemod v'ruchan nemucha. And even if they're rich, he said, this doesn't matter. But he said, but in Hilchas Day he expresses the idea of Jewish Rahmanis, and that's something that's beautiful in our he says, but what also is, you notice in this piece and on the Agada, is how Rabbi Soloveitchik, he says in his essay, realizes the Jewish peoplehood. He says, all of us, how we stand by the Seder night, and you've had the Seder night. I've had at the Seder night relatives that weren't Shomrei Shabbos. And they sat and they looked at the Haggadah and they translated it, and the sense of of being together was so strong. And he says, and they realized it, and Rav Soloveitchik realized it, and this is what he's telling. He's saying that today all of us, religious Jew, secular Jew, come together in the sense of being together and saying Haggadah together. And being part of one people, he says, okay, so this is and in it he also includes the Shoah, the sense of love, and the destructive, the sense of destruction, and the sense of which people, all of us, have to feel today, that the sense of And I picked another piece, the third piece, the final piece with Rabbi Soloveitchik. He said, I want to talk about, he says, it's Rabbi Soloveitchik and his idea of Torah Shebal Peh. You know, the part of Bikurim, bringing the first fruits to the Beis Hamikdash, and the Seder come together. He says the Bikurim was a Thanksgiving offering. It was a Thanksgiving from the Jewish people for the thanking of the land, and in turn of Yetzias Mitzrayim, because without Yetzias Mitzrayim there wouldn't have been a land. The Seder night is very much like, but it's a little bit different. It's the idea of Yetzias Mitzrayim and then the coming the land. And he says, but the story of that whole story is not a story of psukim, of chumash. It's a story of a choice of responding to that whole sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, not taking the psukim of Shmos through Bo and including it into the Agada. But he takes it. It begins with learning drash. It begins with learning Mishnayos. It's a night, an experience, which is not the only yontif, but it's an experience of Torah Shebal Peh. And he goes on and he talks about it. But he really doesn't talk about it the way I would understand Rabbi Soloveitchik would talk about it. The sense of Torah to him, and was his whole life. And V'higisa b'yamim v'layla, but the V'higisa b'yamim v'layla is not the intellectual learning of Gemara. V'higisa b'yamim v'layla is his love for Torah. It's like a Jew kisses a Sefer Torah in shul. It's that type of love. It's a sense that he said, when I'm happy, it even makes me more happy. when I'm sad, it takes me out of my sadness. I always have a friend. I always have the Torah with me. So the night of Geula, the night of redemption, we want to talk about Torah, how important Torah is to us. And that's really a major reason why that was included in this night. And in this night is a special halacha of Torah. It's a special halacha of Torah to talk about the Nisim. It's a night of Sipa Yetzias Mitzrayim. I one time heard a speech of Rabbi Soloveitchik talking about the United Nations recognizing the state of Israel. And he says, he said, if there's only one purpose, and there probably is only one purpose for the United Nations, is the idea of allow us to declare a Jewish state. And that was a great ness. But it also was a great ness that after that, they wanted to forget about it. They were sorry that they even did that. That freedom, that sense of the United Nations and the others to not care about the survival of the Jewish people, left it in the hands of Am Yisrael itself with blood. The Maya Chayi, Rabbi Soloveitchik said, to give our lives to create that Jewish state. And that was the ness, to realize the ness, how HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the hands of Hashem in history, the hands of Hashem in history, even in Mitzrayim. Imagine, he said, that if Paro would have freed the Jewish people, we would still be indebted to him. Is that sense that Paro didn't free us, that we went out beyond Chazaka, through our own hands, through the hands of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He says that was also a great ness. So to understand the night to understand the night is to understand that night of the Seder is to understand that the Nisim, and that's part of the Sipa Mitzrayim. But it's not only that. He says because and Chazal, the Talmud Torah could also be a lot of other things. If you take a look at a sefer on a Lumdish sefer on Mitzrayim, on Pesach, it would talk about what's the tokav of B'dikas Chametz, what's B'dikas Chametz after Bittul, the idea of a renter and a rentee of Chametz. The mekachtas. He says the brachas that you make on each part of the Seder night, and the halachas al Yemotzei, the chametz nuksha, the sveikos with dikas chametz. That is also Talmud Torah. That's a way of that's a way of celebrating the yontif through Torah. It's a way of teaching us again a connection to Torah, but not to forget that tonight is a special night of Torah, the night to realize the Nisim. And he brings together our today, the today of the Jewish people having a sovereign nation, the idea that and how important he felt. So this is a picture of the Seder night that I see that I took out 3 parts that I thought would be important to share, and hopefully we got that. But I also want to talk about Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan. Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan was a gadol adar, and how did I get to him? How did I get to him? Okay, truthfully, I got to him. I had to write a master's thesis to get my smicha in YU. The master's thesis was on Chaim Chernowitz. Chaim Chernowitz was a great maskil, but he was a great historian, and he was a great Talmud Chacham at one time. He was Rav in Odessa. He really was Rav in Odessa. The Meshach Chachma helped him put together the Rav Meir Simcha, the Gadol Adar, Rav Meir Simcha, helped him put together the Erev in Odessa, as he was Rav in Odessa. But one of the Talmidim of Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan was this Chaim Chernowitz, And at that point in time in his life, for many years after, he remained a Ben Torah. And even when he was in Eretz Yisrael, he wrote he wrote like a digest of a number of Masechtas, of a Kama, Sukkah, and so forth, that has the Haskama of Rav Kook, and as one of the Haskamas. And Rav Kook thought it was very important. But let me go to so this is, so when I wrote my master's, after many years, like maybe 40, 50 years later, I took a look. I said, you know what? Let me start taking a look at the Rebbe. Let me start writing about the Rebbe and not the Talmud. Because in the sense, how my experience and my learning experience, it has always been with the Torah world. So let me connect, let me link together that writing and with the Gadol Hador. So let's talk about. Let me talk about a little bit about who he was and how he impacts us on the Pesach, on Pesach. So he says, well, let me talk a little bit about who Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan was. He was Rav in Kovna. Briefly, he was born 1817 and he was nifter in 1896. Made a major impact. He says, let me just tell you, just like almost bullet points of what he did as a Rav. He helped the poor during a drought. He allowed kidneys to be eaten on Pesach. He helped Kovna to rebuild after a fire. He decided against the use of the Karfo Esrog because of their exorbitant price. He included rabbis of towns and commissions using his contacts, because he had many. He induced Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch to write a defense against the anti-Semites that slandered Talmud. He took a leadership position in his effort to save the Volozhin Yeshiva. Don't forget, Kovna was bordering on Volozhin. He stopped the establishment of a modern rabbinical school, involved in the recognition of a synagogue rabbi over government rabbis. It was the derech in those times that even in Vilna, before the Second World War, Reb Chaim Eiser was the Rav, was from the Rav from the Kehila, and there was a great Rav too, but he was a rabbi kind of that he was the government rabbi, and to note, which is not known that well, is that they wanted to bring together that Rabbanis in Vilna, and they wanted to put Rabbi Soloveitchik as the combined Rav of Vilna, that to bring together the synagogue Rav and the government Rav. And in many ways, he functioned that way, Rabbi Soloveitchik, even in America. And he says, but he focused all of his learning and Choshen Mishpat was Rebbe Elchanan's favorite piece of Torah, and in the study of the Lithuanian yeshivas, a fellow named Professor Stemfer wrote the Lithuanian yeshivas, and this was almost the last component of it. Was Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan had helped start and officially ran the Perushim. They were called Perushim. They were young men who at this time was supported by in that kollel that they gathered money for, and they learned Shulchan Aruch, and that's he was the official Rav of that time, and he help and do many things, and not only in supporting that, but also creating new drachim in Aruch of the Shulchan Aruch. Together with Rabbi Yisrael Salanta, he bravely fought harsh decrees of the Russian government, and he was confronting numerous issues affecting Russian Jewry. He's in the 1881. In 1881, there were terrible. It was induced by the Tsar of Russia himself, and no one could stop it. The Maskilim, who already had contacts with Goyish world, with the government world, he couldn't really stop it, and somehow this old rabbi, Rabbi Elchanan, who couldn't speak Russian, I was able to stop the pogroms. It's Stanford himself sent me source material on this, and there was a Vilna Talmud. It was a Vilna Talmud who was very poor, and he went to university and he became a great professor of in Russia of philosophy and of religion, and he was introduced one day with his contacts to the Tsar, and the Tsar was very impressed with him. But the Tsar looked at him, and they had total chutzpah when they deal with Jews. He looked at him and he said to him, "You'll become." When he walked out, he was told, he said, "You know what he means, you'll become one of us, is that you have to become a convert." And I guess you have to become a convert or else. And he did become a convert. And throughout his history, throughout his life, he saved countless Jews. He stopped pogroms, he stopped massacres, he stopped anti-Semitic attacks on the Jewish people. And somehow Rabbi Elchanan was able to link with him, and he stopped. How did he stop the pogroms? The pogroms stopped for 2 days in the London Times, or the story of how the Tsar is killing innocent Jews. And it shamed the Tsar so much that he stopped. And this is how, one of the ways how Rabbi Elchanan, not only the Posek, not only the one who sat and learned and every minute that he could, because he was so busy of being the Rav of the town, and not only the Rav of the town, his chuvas went to America, to South America, all over, where people from all over the world came to him with eitzes, with questions and shilas, and he was able to do as much as he did. And so let me talk about a personal look of this, and he wrote just before I do that, he wrote 3 major tzvarim: the Be'er Yitzchak, the Ein Yitzchak, and the Nachlas Yitzchak. The Be'er Yitzchak and what he wrote first, and the Ein Yitzchak is tshuvas, but his tshuvas are like sitting down and opening and listening to a shiur. It's not a short piece. It's not a page or 2. It's pages. He goes through Gemara. He goes through Shas. He goes through the Poskim. He goes through Noda B'Yehudas, the Chasam Sofis. He deals. Let me just stop that. He deals with. He deals with the major problems that they had to deal with. In his first sefer, Be'er Yitzchak, he talks about tshuvas on chametz and matzah, and that's why I'm going to link that into the Pesach program. And but his major efforts were in really being matir agunos. Hundreds of agunos were matir. No one was able to matir them, and he used the heta of Chaim Volozhin, and the heta was called Trey Rube. In English, it's called double majority. So even in the most difficult cases of aguna, where the Shulchan Aruch would stop and exhaust itself and say, "I can't do anything anymore," he took the next step. And initially, he was approached by great rabbis, rabbanim, who didn't want to go along with him. But when they understood that it was Rav Chaim Volozhin yet that came up with this idea. And let me just give you one example that you get a feel for it. He says, a boat caught fire and sank. And in spite of the stringency of marriage and the rabbinic law, because there were Jewish men on that boat, and women couldn't marry, they didn't get a get. So how were they to live? And he says, and there is a halacha that water, mayim she'ein lo himself, water that has no bound, is understood in the Gemara as understanding that person didn't die. It can be assumed. So he says he uses tray coolers. The majority of passengers die, and majority of those lost in oceans die. So using those tray rubas, which was a great chiddush, a great novel idea, just to be matir agunos. So let's talk about how a Talmud talks about his Rebbe. And he says he was a baki b'shasim poskim and rishonim. His sources were the Rashba, the Rosh, the Ritva, the Shita Mekubetzes, the Shulchan Aruch and all its commentaries. By the time he was 18 years old, he was baki in all the 4 halakim of Shulchan Aruch, the Be'er Heitiv, which is a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. No to be Yehuda Chassam Sofer, and he considered himself something like the Chassam Sofer. Those were 2 people, 2 poskim that were not part of the books and svar of the Shulchan Aruch, that they had, you go to them as external sources to learn what they have to say on Pesach. And he dealt with it, that he quoted them and he fought with them many times. He says he was a baki in Sveika Dioraisa the Rabbanon, in Svek Sveika. This is the genius of Shas in order to deal with and solve problems, but they are the most difficult things to deal with. Chazakos, the status quo, Migu and Umdana. He says he had a great. He writes that he had a great netiya, a great preference for kulas. He says he had personal pain when he couldn't come up with a kula. He says he says, but what should I do? He says the doors are closed, and he writes in one of his tshuvas, I can't give her a head. I don't know what to do. And he says and when an aguna problem came to him, he kind of opened up his mind, and he said, rabbis of old, stand here and listen with me to the cry, to the pain of this woman who's coming, who wants to be freed from her anchor, from her chains. He says, and together he says, let's try to give her a heta. But on the day of his, and he was sick for quite a few, evidently it seems for quite a few weeks or even months, Rabbi Elchanan, on the day of his Petira, he writes, and it paraphrases, whoever wasn't in Kovna in those days didn't see the great Kovet Torah. He says, everybody felt that the father of Israel, Aviyam Shel Yisrael, is leaving us. The streets were filled near the Rav's house. All the shuls were filled, and people were davening and saying Tillim. In one moment, Beit Mincha L'Mayriv, someone got up and started crying. He says, he left us. And he says, and then Misha, at that point, someone got up and wanted to say Kaddish. But the Kaddish was not our Kaddish. It was the Kaddish of Yiskadal v'Yiskadash, B'Yomechon u'V'Chaye de Ravna Reb Yitzchak Elchanan. They wanted to put Reb Yitzchak Elchanan into the words of the Kaddish itself, which was once an approach that typed in the Bisman HaRambam. And so the love and the affection that they had was unbelievable. Rabbi Green, how much time do I have? Could I go on?
About 5 more minutes.
Okay, I'll give you 5 more minutes. I'll talk fast. He says, I want to just talk a little bit about, an introduction that rabbis give to the Shulchan Aruch and to their svarim that they write on halachas and poskim. And one of and he wrote Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan wrote long introductions, and from those introductions you almost could see what he feels, what his regoshim were, what his derech was. So he starts off with the idea that if HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives a nevuah, it could be changed. It could be changed because the chait is going. But if a navi, a nevuah, it can't be changed because a latova, a navi can't. So he deals with the idea that that Chazal and the Achronim talk about, that in the Shira, Nazi Ashir, it says ad yavor, ad yavor. You know, and the pshat of the Posek is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu saved everyone, saved Am Yisrael and not Mitzrayim and so forth. So given that idea, he says, it says that Ezra didn't have the opportunity, and because of the averis of that door that the previous door had. And we didn't have true freedom, and it wasn't truly a sovereign state. And he talks about it in Derech Drush. And so how could that be? Moshe Rabbeinu was a Navi. So how could that be? So if Moshe Rabbeinu was a Navi, he says those words had to come true. That Ad Yavor, the Drush says, is that even Ezra should have in his time, another generation should have in their time a full geula, the way it should be. So the Medrash talks about it. He says, when Moshe spoke, it wasn't the Navi speaking. It was like the words of Hashem. And if it's the words of Hashem, the chait could be going. Chait could be going. And using this idea, and I had more time with develop it in more detail, but as the gist of the idea is that he's talking about and saying that I want you to understand, he says that this promise that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave to Am Yisrael will be fulfilled, and it will be fulfilled even if we don't come through as much as as you would expect HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants us to. But nevertheless, I want you to know, he says that the words of Hashem will be executed, will be real, and the Geula will happen, even if we don't come back totally. And this is, in a sense, what Rabbi Elchanan was doing with his Koach Tehet. I'm going to create a Torah for the Jewish people. He says that with my psukim, that I'll give them Heterim, that it'll be easier for them to come back. It'll be easier for them to follow a Torah of Heta, the Koach Tehet Adiv. That even though they're not completely full coming back in tshuva, I want you to know that that I perceive and I want them to come back, and my psukim, my learning will help that derech. So you see, even in his drush, if I got it into the introduction, you see his ideas of Koach Tehet Adiv. I have like about if he give me another 10 minutes, I'll be okay. I just want to talk about or I could stop and we could we'll do it next year. But what I really wanted to do is this major piece, and this is really the end, but it will take some time. Is that to deal with Mechiras Chametz, its history, how it started.
Go ahead.
And how it looks today, and I think that's very important. So give me. We'll try to cut through as much as I can, and I want and that will make closure.
Okay.
Said, Rav Zevin wrote a lot, and even Herschel Schechter, is just one year. I remember we were in Kollel together. Dealt with the Mechiras Chametz. So he says initially Mechiras Chametz was such that even the Mishnayos, the Toseftas, and interestingly enough, he quotes the Toseftas and he footnotes Lieberman in it, and he says Rav Zevin, and he talks about the Mishnah, the Tosefta, and the Gemara, that when you had Chametz left over by Pesach time, what you would do is you would sell it to a guy. You didn't go to the rabbi. You would actually, and you would give it to the guy. And you would give him a matana, or you would sell it to him. And it was finished because he couldn't be over by your royal, by your mother. And if you were on a boat and you go and you had chametz with you, you had to get rid of it. or if you had so you sold it to your friend, the guy. So what happened that all of a sudden that we have such a complicated form that does this mechiras chametz, that we can't go over to the guy that you know and say, here, I'm selling you my chametz. What really happened was a major economic change from the 1650s for another 150 years or more, that the Jews, that Poland and Lithuania were agricultural communities, were agricultural countries. They made their wealth from selling wheat. They made their wealth as farmers. And all of a sudden, the idea of changing wheat and turning wheat into vodka, into alcohol, became the major business. And the Jews became part of it, because who else could the pirates trust but the Jew that ran the taverns, the Jew that sold the vodka, and trustworthy enough to return the profits to the pirates. And all of a sudden comes Pesach, and they have they have chametz all over, and they have chametz in the taverns, chametz in places where they stored it. What do we do? And what do we do with that chametz? All of a sudden, you can't take the chametz and bring it out and sell it, because if you did that, there would be no business. So all of a sudden came the heterim, the idea of kesef and shtar and all the other things that would seem to many as harama, as loopholes. But the Chachamim tried very hard to give great detail into it, and it needs the time, and I would do it, but not for now. He says is how all of these halachas came about, and also all of a sudden the animals were fed. Were fed with the leftover wheat that was processed in making schnapps, in making this yayin saraf. So how did they deal with it? So again, another set of tshuvas. And Rabbi Elchanan in 70 pages deals with two shilas. One is a shaila that he dealt with, that what happens if someone leaves his home and he can't come back till after Bia Chometz. He comes back just before the Seder. So could someone go ahead and sell and sell the Chometz? And Rabbi Elchanan deals with it, and of course comes up with Torah, the idea of heter and how it could be done, even and to be mizaka him. And then he deals with the shtaros that were not written properly, and how do I deal with that? So there kind of ends how a Rosh Yeshiva and how a Gadol Adar, a great Posek, one a Gadol Adar as a Rosh Yeshiva, one as a Gadol Adar as a Posek in a previous generation, and how they helped us enjoy our Pesach. Ashikayach.
Yeshikoach. Yeshikoach. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.